I'm going to begin with the topic that I believe is the most representative of this edition of the festival, of this year, which is war. There has been at least 8 events in the festival talking exclusively about war, dedicated to this topic under one perspective or the other. And I will not start randomly with the talk of Lucio Caracciolo. Lucio Caracciolo is famous in Italy for being the founder and director of a geopolitics magazine called Limes. He is a personality at this festival because he comes every year, and every year the hall is completely full and there are people lining outside of the church. His event is usually in San Francesco Church. People sitting outside, people standing outside. He's a really popular talk, let's say. And to be honest, I am not very much in sync with his perspective, nor with his opinions in general. But I'll tell you more about this later. He gave 2 talks at this festival. The first one I haven't been able to attend because every seat was already taken. You had to reserve them in advance, and already days before the festival started, they were already all completed, sold out. The other event was titled "The World at War and the Chaos of Politics," and took place on Tuesday, 7th of May at 9 p.m. His talk has been very much focused on Italy in the current geopolitical global situation, okay? And since this is an international video, I'm not gonna talk so much about the position of Italy. He said Italy is a country that is alone at the moment, and we were already alone, but this whole war situation has highlighted this fact even more. This means that whoever has problems can sort of unload them on us, but we cannot not do the same with anyone else. We are a country that has little importance, but a lot of value. So being alone while everything around us changes means that we have to take responsibilities that we are not used to take. The international or global context is the following. There is a 3-folded competition: USA, China, and Russia. There is the war in Ukraine, which is a not hot war between USA and China. And there is the war in Gaza. He called this whole thing the big war. I cannot say the Great War because we call the Great War the First World War. La Guerra Grande, the big war. Our life or survival as Italians depends by the freedom of circulation in the Mediterranean. Italy doesn't have much materie prime, raw materials, so we have to import a lot, and we also export a lot. But the situation in Gaza is putting this freedom of circulation in discussion. Many of you might know that there is an issue with the population of the Houthi in Yemen. These are a Yemeni minority that has been taking power progressively during the years, and nowadays they have a lot of power in Yemen, and they are blocking the Suez Channel so that there is some sort of a international war situation going on in that passage of the Mediterranean. And apparently Italy has been sending drones to combat ships of the Houthi. So we have been having already a war behavior. Then, of course, he talked about the demographic crisis. I mentioned this aspect already in last year's report. It's a very Italian aspect, I guess. Not completely, though. There are definitely other countries in the Western world that have been going through a demographic crisis, although we are the worst together with Japan. We are not making enough kids to replace the population that has been dying. Especially, we have a very large number of elderlies and a quite limited number of younger Italians. Furthermore, we have a very dramatic escape of young Italians, especially between their 20s and 40s. Basically, after they get their educational qualifications, they escape away abroad because the general market of work for young Italians is very, very unfavorable. So we have this phenomenon where we import young immigrants from third world countries that are, I don't know what word he used exactly, but we might not get the best minds of these countries. And at the same time, we are losing the best minds of our country due to this escape of the brains, as we call it. We have huge problems with mafia, with organized crime, especially the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, apparently is nowadays present all over the globe, although it's from Calabria. Calabria is a very poor region that is not very highly considered in Italy, by the way. There's not much entrepreneurship or livelihood in an economical sense. So he also made some jokes about this apparent contrast between the lack of legal entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurship of the 'Ndrangheta groups that have been very successful. This presence of organized crime on the territory means also that we are very unattractive under the perspective of investments, of foreign investments. He talked about immigration, and he finished his speech mentioning a positive note, which is that we have the possibility to collaborate with Americans. And how to say this? I just don't agree that this is a positive note. I'm sorry, but you might know at this point, if you've been following me for a while, that I am very, very much against the positions of the United States. I am very much against their attitude in their foreign politics. And I am also not sharing their values and their overall culture that they want to export. In fact, one of the reasons why I started traveling to the United States a few years back was exactly because I was aware that we were importing, so to speak, a lot of American culture in Italy, and I wasn't aware of how much until I actually came here. And I wanted to get to know this culture with clean eyes, without the filter of journalists or the filter of, Italian glasses. So I came here, and after a few years, I have to say that I now have even less enthusiasm for the fact that our country and the whole Europe is getting Americanized. So I am definitely not agreeing with Caracciolo when he says that our only possibility is to collaborate with Americans, and this is a positive note. Nonetheless, I am not an expert here. He is the expert. I know nothing about foreign politics. He's been dealing with foreign politics and geopolitics for decades now, so who am I to comment on what he says? The personal perspective I wanted to share about this talk was not so much this very low importance opinion, more so about the attitude, the mindset, the approach that people like Caracciolo, experts of geopolitics like Caracciolo, have when they talk about international affairs. It just makes me so depressed. Every time I hear some expert in foreign affairs speaking, I just have this strong emotional reaction because it's as if they were talking about a game. It's as if they were in front of a Risiko game. I think Risiko is an international board game, right? And they were just describing the movement of little pieces of plastic on the board. All they seem to care about is strategy. I'm sure as people, as private people, this is not all they care about, but in the job that they do in this discipline of geopolitics, or however you want to call it, all they care about, all they talk about, all they analyze is strategies, diplomatic relationships, commercial relationships, economy, politics. I find all this extremely dehumanizing. Wars, occupations, attacks, anything regarding the military really has huge consequences. The civil population is highly determined in their everyday private lives by what these foreign diplomatics relationship dictate. So to talk about them only and exclusively in terms of strategy, in terms of what's more convenient or less convenient for each country, for each president, for each government, is just dehumanizing. And this is my main criticism to Caracciolo, which is not only a criticism to him, but he's as I said, a big personality in this sphere of geopolitics in Italy. So I think he has quite a bit of power and therefore responsibility in these matters. Let's go ahead with the other talks about war. One interesting presentation about war has been the one made by Domenico Picco and Valerio Pellizzari, both journalists, that was titled Kalashnikov or White Flag? I read from the presentation. Barely 3 kilograms of iron and wood. Anyone can carry it. It resists to sand, mud, ice, hot temperatures. If it breaks, $40 are enough to buy a new one. The Kalashnikov is diabolically perfect. It can transform a child in a killer. It's the weapon that has made most deaths in the history of humanity. Everywhere on the planet, this Soviet gun distinguishes who has the power from who doesn't. Domenico Picco, who was presenting this, as I said, he's a journalist, but he's been kidnapped by soldiers of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011 and from the Syrian jihadists in 2013. He's been in prison for 5 months. He's been writing numerous books on the topics of war report. He's been someone who, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, has suggested to Pope Francesco a trip to the Red Square and Kiev as an unarmed negotiator. He also talked about the figure of Giandomenico Picco, who is a UN diplomat who has just recently died a couple of months ago, from Friuli, who has had a long career at the UN. He's been living in Connecticut the last year of his life, and he's been an important negotiator for the withdrawal of the Soviet army from Kabul in 1988. If you want to know more about this honorable freelance character born in Udine, The New York Times has just released a full article about him. I leave the description in the description of this video. Have you ever wondered who produces, who designs and fabricates the weapons that people all around the world use? Well, in Udine, we have been having the chance to listen to one of these people talking. Vito Alfieri Fontana, an ex-entrepreneur from Bari. At 26, he inherited the factory of his father, who was producing landmines. His son, at 8 years old, asking him what he does for a job, triggered his crisis of conscience, where Fontana finally dropped his job and decided to spend the rest of his life to clean up lands from landmines. This story I find so impressive. Just a normal person who grows up with his parents owning a factory that makes weapons, and the most horrible type of weapon, which is the landmine, a weapon that makes entire portions of territory unusable, uninhabitable for the local populations for years and decades after wars have finished. And by the way, there is a stimulating interview that Corriere della Sera, a national newspaper in Italy, has published with Vito Alfieri Fontana. If you're interested, you can read it. You can also, with the help of Google Chrome or Google Translate it into English or your language to be able to understand it. I recommend it. It's not very long, and it makes you understand quite a few things about landmines and about how a human soul can be triggered, sometimes for the better. He wrote a book about his experience that is titled, "I Was the Man of the War." You know, all the talks about war that I mentioned so far, I noticed they are from the perspective of who makes the war, of who attacks, of who is in a position of power. And they are all featured by technical, strategical, practical elements. The following talks that I'm going to mention instead provide us with a gaze, a perspective onto who is a victim of war, on the populations who are invaded by the militaries and have to live together in their everyday life with war, in a position of subjugation. And if I call the previous perspective as characterized by strategy, practicality, and technicalities, I am going to call this following perspective as the perspective of human comprehension. Populations under siege. Blockada. Sarajevo under siege. Podcast presentation. Salam Shalom. A scenic reading of the history of two fathers, one Israeli and one Palestinian, sadly united in peace by the same sufferance, the experience of losing their kids. A photographic exhibition called In Kurdistan with the Yazidi community, and a discussion about the resistance of the Yazidi population in Shangal, Iraqi town under siege. The Yazidi, in case you don't know, are a religious group in Kurdistan. Some define them as Kurds, some others say they are not Kurds. In any case, they have been victims of a genocide between the years 2014 and 2017. If you want to read a few lines from Wikipedia about this, I leave 2 links in the caption of this video. Mir, a book presentation about perspectives of peace at the border with Ukraine, is also part of this war seen from the perspective of human comprehension. Is its author has been traveling along the Ukrainian border during the war, so not in war zone, but in areas that were right at the border with it. And he's been collecting talks, opinions, thoughts, ideas of people who live in these areas. We're talking about especially Moldavia and Transnistria, which are also areas that are risking war. Finally, the last event that was dedicated to war from a human comprehension perspective was the presentation, the talk by Francesca Mannocchi, also a recurrent guest at Vicino Lontano, a well-known personality in Italy. She's a war reporter, a journalist, writer, movie director. And speaking of perspective of human comprehension, I have to say her talk was perfectly described by this expression, human comprehension. She basically travels all over war zones and is able to narrate them in a way that makes us, people in power in countries where there is no war, not yet at least, what it means to live in a war situation. During the war, people keep falling in love, people get married, people make bread, people take care of their plants on the balcony. War report is not only the one of mutilated or wounded bodies, is especially the one that shows us that even in times of war, life goes on and people keep having hope. Mannocchi has been narrating us in the couple of hours in the evening of the 8th of May about a few stories of people that she met in war zones. And I think she wanted to try to make us not only feel emotions, but also understand certain human conditions. She told us the story of Irina, Ukrainian, mother of 2 kids of 2 and 7 years old. The day war started in Ukraine, she took her kids, her sister, traveled all the way to Germany, dropped them there, and went back to her home in Kiev and wore the military uniform. She was expecting the war, she was prepared for it, even though everyone around her was mocking her for this. She wore the uniform and she went to join the military to fight against the aggressor. The story of Irina is a story of what it means to be mother, what it means to be a mother, a woman, and a person in a war zone. She has been having a couple of different tasks, and she finally ended up being the one responsible for Cargo 200. The Cargo 200 is the truck that goes pick up dead bodies of soldiers on the field. Her job was to sit in an office, record the data of all soldiers coming into the war and going to fight at the front. And then every once in a while to accompany the team that with the Cargo 200 would go collect all these dead bodies that then needed to be identified. And Irina's job was finally to organize the celebrations for their death, which are important celebrations for the still living soldiers, and call the families of the fallen soldiers to inform them. The story of Irina, I think, is the story of the necessity felt by a person attacked to defend themselves. And for her, who was a woman and a mother, this meant to forget to be a mother. In fact, her plan has been for her two kids to forget her as a mother and consider her sister as a mother. Her sister, who was able to take care of them in a foreign country. And this is a theme that emerged also in the next story that she told, which was the story of Walid. Walid is a man in a Palestinian refugee camp, and he or she also described us what refugee camps are and how they work. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but refugee camps are camps that in the vast majority of the cases end up not being temporary like they are supposed to, but they become permanent. And the living condition in these camps is obviously absolutely horrible. People live on top of each other in temporary huts. But especially she described very effectively the mindset, the psychological condition of a person constantly living in a refugee camp, constantly living in a temporary situation that becomes effectively permanent, although in their mind it's still not. It's a whole thing. But let's go back to Walid. She accompanied a local colleague, friend, to visit this man in this refugee camp. This man turns out to be the father of a 16-year-old kid who was just killed. This 16-year-old was described before she arrived to the father's home to be a civilian, a Palestinian civilian. Although as soon as she entered the house of his father, there was a huge poster with the picture of his 16-year-old kid wearing a Kalashnikov. So she was confused and she started asking questions. How is it that this kid was civilian? And it would make everything too long now to tell the whole story of Walid and his son Abu. But the juice of the story is that Abu was a kid, 13-year-old kid who wanted to study and to live a regular life. And when he was 13, with his little friends, he decided he wanted to go see the sea. And you might say, they live in Gaza, they are from Gaza, how do they want to see the sea? They are by the sea, they see it every day. Well, apparently it's not like that. Apparently these areas do not go all the way to the sea. There are a few hundred meters of land, of just not built land, that are behind the wall of the refugee camp, and then you can see the sea. These few hundred meters of land are occupied by Israeli military, and it is not allowed for Palestinians to cross this wall. For Palestinians, though, this is the land of their ancestors. This is the land of their fathers, grandfathers. This is Palestinian land. This is home for them. So very often kids, when they grow a little bit older, they want to go and see the sea. Walid was one of them. He went one day with his friends to see the sea, and he came back to his father and he said, "Dad, our land behind the wall is so beautiful. It's just as beautiful as our ancestors' stories described it. Why can't we live there?" After he saw the sea, Abu got arrested. One night, Israeli militaries entered into his father's hut and just took him away. At 13 years old, Abu has been in prison for 3 years without trial and without even knowing the reasons why he was arrested. Apparently, this is very common in Palestinian refugee camps. Palestinians can get arrested at any time of the day or the night and be kept in jail for a period from 6 months to years without even knowing why they have been arrested, without an official accusation. So Abu, after 3 years of jail, was freed. He went back to his father, but he didn't care about studying anymore. All he could do was to get a weapon and go fight the invaders of his ancestors' land. So what was the meaning that she gave to this story? The meaning was that Abu was clearly a terrorist. Abu is exactly the type of person who is defined by media as a terrorist. So his father would turn on his TV, and on Israeli mainstream media, he would hear that a terrorist was killed that day, which was his kid. For his father, though, Abu was a martyr, a hero. So the point is, what is true? Which of the two versions of the story is true and which one is false? Both of us are true. We cannot say that one is true and one is false. Both of us are true. Everything and nothing is true. It depends on what perspective you get. So her message was, let's not ask ourselves, how should we call this? How should we label this? Instead, let's ask us, why did this happen? Living in an occupied land not only takes away from you your rights, but it also takes away from you the future. You can just imagine what it means for a kid to be born in a place where she said it's normal to go to sleep like this. A place where kids from 11 years old or people of any age can be taken from their own homes at any time and go to, they call it administrative jail. They don't know why they are taken. There is no trial, no official accusations, and they don't know when they're going to be released. So your future is what is taken away from you. I guess we can all understand how Abu, when he got out at 16 after 3 years of jail, he didn't see any other choice than to get a weapon and go be a fighter for his land. She also told us the story of Ido, an Israeli 17 years old. Ido is 17 and he doesn't want to go fight the war. This reminds me another person I met by chance a couple of months ago here in New York City. He's an Israeli young man of 20 and something years old who just came here to work. His job in Israel has sent him here. And after a few hours that we were hanging out, he told me that he was supposed to come before to New York, but he had to go and fight and be a soldier in the war. And I replied, "Oh, I'm very sorry. How does it work there when they call you to go to the army? Are you able to just refuse and not go?" And he looked at me, hesitated for a second, and told me, "Well, you're not obliged to go, but it's not a good thing not to go. It's your duty to protect your family, your country, your people. Who would refuse to do that? If they call you, you go." And now I heard the story of Ido, who at 17 years old refused to go to fight. And the people around him asked him, "If you don't agree with the laws of this country, why don't you just go away?" And Ido answers that these people that ask him this are the same people who ask to the Palestinians why they don't go away if they don't like the way they have been treated in their country. The answer is simple. This is my home. Why would I go away? I want to report to you one final reflection that Francesca Mannocchi did, and it's about the concept of victim. A victim is innocent by definition. A victim suffers something, suffers a condition that is imposed to them by someone else. A victim is subjected to the events. So if you narrate the stories of people in war zones as victims, you take away from them the political element that they bear. You just bury them underneath the dramatic past that they have had. You tell them, you are too fragile to have a future. You take away from them their voice, their political voice. So this is what she tries to do. She tries to be very careful of telling these stories and depicting these people as just mere victims, because they have a political message to send. They have a future, or they want to have a future, and therefore their message cannot just be the one of a tragedy they have suffered in the past. So she invites us to ask ourselves, what would I have done if I were in the shoes of Walid? What would I have done? What choice would I have made if I were released after 3 years of jail, like Abu did? What would I have done in that case? What would I do if I was an Israeli young man and I was called to the weapons? What would I do?